Behind the scenes, though Beijing was growing alarmed, Mugabe's disastrous handling of the economy had gone on for years, leaving more than 60% of the population below the poverty line, and government debts to China unpaid. But what provoked Beijing's ire in early 2016 was a decision to enforce an indigenization law that required foreign ventures to reserve at least 51% of their ownership for local Zimbabweans. The law was meant to promote black empowerment, as well as Mugabe's popularity, but China felt the law unfairly targeted its investments, including 2 diamond mines, whose assets were to be absorbed into a state-owned company. So angered were Chinese leaders that they summoned Zimbabwe's foreign minister to Beijing to hear their grievances. Illustration by Andrew Ray for China. There loomed a bigger danger and opportunity: the long-awaited political transition. As the nonagenarian Mugabe approached the end of his term in 2018, China feared chaos. But after decades of waiting, it hoped to push a freer investment climate that would open up Zimbabwe's abundant mineral resources. As a one-party state, China has preferred to deal with ruling parties and their often authoritarian leaders, and to hope that these old friends never pass from the scene, like the Communist Party itself. The wake-up call, says Yoon Sun, a senior associate at the Stimson Center in Washington, came in Libya with the fall of the dictator Col. Muammar al-Gaddafi in 2011. China was heavily invested in Libya. It imported 10% of the country's oil supply, but blindsided by the revolt against its ally. During the turmoil, more than 30,000 Chinese workers had to be airlifted out of Libya, and China lost billions of dollars worth of investments and loans. Elsewhere, China's sheer size could pull wayward countries back into its orbit. In Zambia, the poor treatment of workers at Chinese-run copper mines provoked a national outcry. The populist Michael Sata ran for the presidency in 2006 on an anti-Chinese platform, vowing to prevent Zambia from becoming a dumping ground for Chinese workers. His defeat led to the first anti-Chinese riots in Africa. 5 years later, Sata again whipped up anger at Chinese profiteers and won the presidency easily. Once in office, however, the old firebrand mellowed. He was soon a compliant partner with Beijing. A sign, perhaps, that China's influence on the Zambian economy had become so vital that fighting against it would be too costly. The situation was different in Zimbabwe, where the uncertainty over succession spawned 2 sides vying for China's favor. Mugabe's heir apparent was Vice President Mnangagwa, a former security chief who trained as a guerrilla in China in the 1960s and earned the nickname Crocodile. Mugabe, however, wanted to hand the reins over to his 52-year-old wife, Grace, who studied in China. Last month, when Mnangagwa threatened to stop her, Mugabe fired him. As the crocodile went into hiding, Zimbabwe's army chief, his ally, flew to Beijing for an official visit with top military leaders. Barely 4 days after he returned to Zimbabwe, the coup was underway. Suspicions about Beijing's role in the takeover were only magnified when, in his first week in office, Mnangagwa relaxed the indigenization law and signed a $153 million loan agreement with China. Beijing, citing its official policy of non-interference, vehemently denies any involvement in the coup. And, indeed, such subterfuge seems more in line with past actions of the United States, which secretly helped topple governments from Iran to Chile during the 20th century. But even if Chinese officials told Zimbabwe's army chief in Beijing they merely hoped for a more stable investment environment, this could still be regarded as the first coup carried out with the tacit approval of the 21st century's emerging superpower. China may be new to coups, but it's one of the oldest players in the global money game. In the past few years, 2 separate teams of scientists have found medieval Chinese coins along Kenya's ocean coast. These tiny discs essentially rewrite the history of global trade, showing that Chinese traders reached Africa in the early 15th century, nearly a century before the first European explorers. This is not just a matter of pride. As China now moves to expand its influence in Africa, its state-owned media outlets have seized on these discoveries as proof of China's historical links to the continent, and is the perfect rationale for its return. The coins themselves were symbols of monetary might. First introduced in the 3rd century BC by China's first emperor, the uniform copper coin served as an instrument for China's unification and later its expanding power. The round coins had square holes so they could be strung in 2 belts of 1,000. The belts got so heavy that Chinese merchants in the 9th century began depositing them in one place in return for a paper receipt. They called it feiqian, or flying money. When Marco Polo returned from his travels to China in the 13th century, his tales of paper money were met with disbelief. Europe would not have anything similar until the late 1600s. When Mugabe promised to make the Chinese yuan an official currency, it was mostly a symbolic gesture. There are, as in many of the world's poorest countries, the US dollar reigns supreme, despite almost no American presence. But Chinese economic power is starting to challenge that status. Beijing's push to internationalize the yuan is motivated by more than vanity. The yuan that circulates more widely would spur Chinese trade, reduce its dependence on dollar holdings, and enhance its geopolitical influence. The yuan is hampered by restrictions on its trade on foreign exchange markets. Beijing fears that full convertibility would trigger capital flight. Even so, the yuan's rise is beginning ever so slightly to nudge the system of global currencies away from the US dollar. Last year, the International Monetary Fund added the yuan to its basket of reserve currencies. According to the Bank of China, as of last year, more than 24 countries were accepting the yuan as a reserve currency, including 6 in Africa. The American economy surpassed the British economy in size in 1872, but it took the dollar another 73 years to displace the British pound. At the end of World War II, over the past decades, there have been other contenders and pretenders: the yen, the mark, the euro. But given its rapid rise and its acceptance in distant parts of Africa, the yuan might be in the best position to catch the dollar. It may take decades, even centuries. But China, it should be clear by now, is in it for the very long haul. Brooke Lama is a contributing writer for the magazine. This article was first published by the New York Times Magazine.